Hi guys, and welcome to episode 6 of Programming Thor with Grant. And I think this episode you're going to find really interesting. This is when we introduce the low pass filter. Now, all of the analog monosynths and polysynths really had their characteristics determined by the low pass filter that was inside them. And really, Thor isn't any different. It's what lifts sounds from being, well, frankly, pretty lame, like all of the sounds that we've seen up to date, maybe with the exception of the pulse width modulation. They've all been really pretty weak sounds, possibly musically useful, but fairly dull and uninteresting. But the low pass filter really changes everything. So what I'm going to do is bring Thor into the main rack like we've done before, and as we can see it's on Epic Poly as per usual. So just play that, and we'll do the same as ever. We'll show the programmer and select reset device. Now what I'm going to do is keep the analog oscillator and its full keyboard, middle octave, no semitone offset, no tuning offset. Keep it on the sawtooth wave. But you see we now have the low pass ladder filter in the signal chain, so the sound comes out of analog oscillator 1, goes through the mixer, and bus number 1 from oscillator 1 is enabled here, so that goes into the low pass filter. The low pass filter then goes into the shaper, which isn't enabled, so it just passes through there, goes into the amplifier, which is governed by the amplitude envelope, and then it goes out to the main mix. What we'll do is we'll just change it to a mono legato sound, and we'll make it full sustain, wee bit of an attack, wee bit of a decay, a bit of release at the end. And I want you just to do this blind without playing anything. So if we take the envelope knob down to the 0 position here on the filter, take the velocity knob down to 0, and take the keyboard knob up to full 100%. And if we take the frequency knob down to about 143 Hertz there, keep the resonance knob down at 0, keep it on 24 type 2, I'll explain that later, self oscillation on, and still without pressing anything, if we go down to the modulation matrix and we take a source and we make it a performance mod wheel, amount 100%, and make that the destination filter 1 frequency, not frequency FM but frequency. And if we go to our mod wheel here and put it to the uppermost position, and we'll just give that sound a test. So it's very similar to a lot of the sounds that we were making previously. Nothing remarkable about it. But listen to what happens when we pull the mod wheel from its top position down to its bottom position. So that's a very characteristic sort of brassy low-pass filter sound that you would come to expect from an old monosynth or polysynth from the 70s or 80s. And I think you can hear just how much of a difference it makes if we just cheat a little bit, and if I add a bit of film score reverb to this sound. So you can hear that it's got much more movement in it, much more of a sort of natural, muted tone to it. And by working with the modulation wheel, you can inject a lot of expression into what's essentially a very simple sound. It doesn't have any velocity determined dynamics. The volume is the same every time you press a key. But just with that change of the timbre, depending on what position you've got the mod wheel in, it gives it a much more natural, breathing sound. So that's the effect of changing the frequency on the low pass ladder filter. Now this is called the cutoff frequency because it starts to reduce the intensity of the upper harmonics. So when it's at the highest frequency position, it basically lets through all of the sawtooth waveform. I'll just take off that reverb now. So you're just left with the raw sawtooth sound, and then as you bring down the cutoff frequency, you can hear that the upper harmonics in the sound start to get reduced until you're left with quite a round, pure tone down near the bottom. The other most important parameter in a filter is the resonance, and this is called different names on different synthesizers. Some companies call it resonance, some companies call it emphasis, sometimes it's Q, sometimes it's even feedback, but essentially it's the same thing, and it starts to pick out the overtones in the sound. The further up you put the resonance. So I'll go back to changing the frequency via the mod wheel. And you can hear what a difference to the sound different resonance settings make. So there's a more pronounced sort of vocal wah kind of sound there. And as the resonance increases, it's an even more pronounced wow, until it eventually gets to the point where you can hear each of the overtones resonating quite clearly. And then ultimately, if we push it even further, it goes into what's known as self-oscillating mode and actually produces a tone of its own. So if we just pull it back just a fraction from the self-oscillation, you can hear it really picking out the overtones. So I think there's really no substitute for actually having a playing around with the filter and finding out what the frequency knob and the resonance knob do to the sound. It's just something that you have to have experience of, but it's quite an intuitive sound, and the more you play with a filter, the more you come to recognise what settings to use in what particular application. Just to round off this episode, I just want to introduce the envelope knob here. So this uses the filter envelope, which again is an ADSR module, same as the amplitude envelope, but it allows you to create a control envelope, which changes the cutoff frequency of the filter automatically every time you press a note. So you've got an attack which will take it from the low frequency setting up to a peak, depending on the setting of this envelope depth knob, and then it will decay from a peak to a sustain level, and then it will release once you let go of the note and fall back to 0 and the lowest frequency. So just hear what that sounds like in practice. So that's a very slow filter envelope, so I'll make the attack time shorter and the decay time shorter. So it's a kind of synth brass type sound, and if you bring up the resonance it becomes much more synthetic and funky. So I think that gives you quite a lot to play with. So I think I'll stop this episode here and just give you a chance to experiment, play around with frequency, resonance, envelope depth, and the filter envelope time and sustain level parameters. It's quite a lot to take in, and as I say, it's something that the more experience you get with it, then the more you know how to use it in various situations. So that's that for this episode. So hope to see you next time. Bye for now.